Hello and welcome to a new episode of SPC Conversations. My name is Greg Rose. I serve as Vice President on the Board of Directors of Solidarity with the Persecuted Church. SPC's mission is to help the Christian Church persevere in areas of the world where it faces religious persecution, working with local church leaders to promote sustainability and resist persecution. We also work to increase awareness here in the United States and in Western Europe of the plight of Christians in these areas. As you know, SPC is focusing special attention this year on the challenges facing Christians in parts of Africa, most specifically in Nigeria, where Christians are being killed at a higher rate than anywhere else in the world. We are delighted today to have as our guest the Most Reverend Archbishop Eliud Wabukala, who until recently served as the fifth primate of the Anglican Church of Kenya and has played a major public service role in the fight against corruption in Kenya. Thank you for joining us, Your Grace.
Thank you.
Archbishop Eliud was raised in an Anglican family and as a child used to walk 12 miles a day to attend his primary school in Malakisi. His work life began as a civil servant in Nakuru province, where he became a teacher and then inspector of schools. The call to the priesthood was so strong that in 1985, he began studies in theology as preparation for taking holy orders, and then resumed teaching, then received his doctorate from the Toronto School of Theology. Upon his return to Kenya, he became a lecturer at St. Paul's Theological College in Limuru, and then academic dean. He was elected the first Bishop of Bungoma on the 13th of October in 1996, where he remained until elected Archbishop of Kenya in 2009. In other roles, he served as Vice Chairman of the National Council of Churches of Kenya from 2000 to 2004, National Chairman of that organization from 2004 to 2009, and after retirement, His Grace was chosen by the President of Kenya to serve as Chair of the National Anti-Corruption Campaign Steering Committee. He continues to engage in the field of anti-corruption work, where his achievements have been internationally recognized, and currently serves on a committee of the eminent persons in association with the African Union. Archbishop, I really appreciate your being here. And I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you about is Christianity in Kenya. And what is the nature of the Christian church in Kenya, and what role does it play more broadly in Kenyan society and in governance?
Thank you so much for the interview and for inviting me to this program. Christianity plays a big role in society in Kenya, and of course in many countries in Africa as well. Kenya is about over 79% Christian. Of course, people talk about 80%, and therefore that means the entire society in Kenya is almost Christian, or it's affected by what Christians do. It's not just one church. There are several churches in the country. There are the Catholics, the Anglicans, and very many other Protestant groups and evangelical ministries. And so it's a whole mix of Christianity in the country. But one good thing is that they work together. They have put themselves into various organizations that help to bring a certain similar expressions together. And like you have mentioned, I was chairman of the National Council of Christian Churches in the country. This was initially the umbrella body for all the Protestant churches. And as we grew, we had now another area of the evangelical wing, which also formed another umbrella body. So there are two bodies representing the Protestant family in the country. And then we have our Catholic counterparts. So all those form a huge number of Christian expression, and it can be replicated in many other countries in Africa.
That's fascinating. And one of the things that struck me is that when you were appointed chair of this anti-corruption committee, you were the primate of the Anglican Church in Kenya. And it struck me as fascinating how in Kenya, that wasn't seen as a contradiction, that wasn't seen as a concern, because in many Western European countries and parts of America, the clergy playing that kind of public role can sometimes be viewed almost hostilely, partly because of secular values and so on. And I think that opens up the broader question of the vibrancy of Christian life in Africa as a whole, and obviously Kenya specifically. And maybe you could talk about that aspect of African society.
Well, I maybe I will also clarify that when I was serving as Bishop of Bungoma, Kenya was, and then at the same time I was the chairman of the council of the Protestant churches. That's when I became the chair. I was not by then the Archbishop. And the country was going through a lot of reform. There was agitation for a new constitution, agitation for more democratic space. And that work was being done by the council, the National Christian Council of Churches of Kenya, which I was now a chair. And some of the things we as Christians were fighting was corruption. And so when 2002-3, a new government came in, they wanted a team of people to go around the country and sensitize citizens about the need to avoid corruption, to uphold integrity, and to enhance a kind of cultural change so that we begin a society that was going to be integrity driven. And so the president, I think, in his wisdom, appointed about 26 people from various organizations. So I was picked at that level because I was chair of the council. And then the head of the Muslim, called the Supreme Council of the Muslims, was also appointed. And by then there was a general, I think the Archbishop of the Catholic Church sent his representative who were working together, plus people from the trade union, people from teachers fraternity. So we had representatives all over. It was not just the church. And so we came in as a national anti-corruption campaign. You know, the word campaign means we go and help people understand that. So for us, it wasn't a contradiction. It was a contribution to support government, begin to change people's perception about the entrenched culture of corruption. We actually, that time in Kenya, people will not mention the word corruption. They will say, I'm taking a cup of tea. They will say, give me something small. But we went around telling them, call it corruption, so that when you name it, then you can start to work out how to improve yourselves. So that's how I started being involved. But after retirement, that's when I was asked to chair the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. And that meant a constitutional setup of government and powerful institution that I helped to stabilize so that it can carry out the work of supporting the Kenyan society in the fight against corruption. So it was like two layers that I served. So the first one was a campaign, but after retirement, then I served a constitutional commission as chair, and quite a lot was done through that. So for us, in Kenya, it's not, because everybody, there are many Christians, and then Muslims are part of it. So together, we actually partnered to support initiatives that will make governance and also create an environment for development, for law and order, and for an ethical society. So the church plays that role in a positive way.
A couple of things that I wanted to delve into in what you just said a little bit deeper. One is the fact that you were working on this commission with Muslims quite successfully. As you know, in parts of the world where there are Muslim majority areas or Muslim majority countries, often these are areas where Christians are suffering persecution. And maybe one of the messages that you're giving us is that it doesn't have to be that way. that it doesn't have to be the case that Christians are subject to what they're being subject to. The other thing is the issue of corruption and how often where you have persecution of minorities, these are places where there's a high level of corruption, and the corruption itself insidiously affects how groups are being dealt with towards each other. And sometimes the corrupt politicians and others are actually encouraging the dissent for their own ends. And I'd be curious to talk about this. As you know, Nigeria has a much larger Muslim population, and the country is divided, basically a Muslim north, a Christian south, with much of the persecution happening in the areas of Christian Muslim commingling. And I know that in Kenya, there are parts of Kenya that are Muslim majority. Many people don't understand that about Kenya. And I'm wondering, does Kenya sometimes have those kinds of problems appear in those areas? And what message would you give to Christians in places like Nigeria where the problems are much deeper and harder to confront?
Well, first, I want to say perhaps we are very lucky in Kenya because Christian and Muslims have, in many ways, worked together very smoothly. I have worked with my Muslim brothers when I was heading the NCCK. I will collaborate with the SUPKEM, that's the Supreme Council of Kenyan Muslims, and all of us were, and still work very closely together. We agree on many things that affect our country. Again, when I became the chair of Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, my CEO was a Muslim, and several of my officers, and I was the Archbishop. And so together we will sit in the boardroom and share on what we need to do for the country. And so I would want to say that if people are focused on the common good, religious differences should not be a problem, because other religions are talking about how to improve the human life, how to set up a good system like we have, setting up a good government. So it's a focus on what is good for both of us. And that has helped us in the country. There were times, yes, when we had a lot of tension in terms of the Al-Shabaab and the rest. But we at the top leadership worked together in order to demystify the fact that there's division among us. We will appear on TV, all of us talking the same message. And that goes down to our followers to notice that, yes, it's necessary to work together. So in those countries where there's that kind of animosity, I would challenge the top leadership of those religious organizations to see how they can sit together and perhaps send a message that says, we are one country and we can worship in our different houses, but we can focus together to plant our crops, to build our schools, to have an order in the country. And so that's the good thing we have had I experienced in my ministry, both in the government and also in the church. It may not look the same, but maybe my advice would be that for our Muslim leaders, they should also allow, where they are the majority, work a little bit to be tolerant for the fact that the Christian fraternity can also even establish churches in those regions so that it is both ways. And so that it's not just one way. Muslims can do their work in the Christian majority areas. Christians can also do their work in the Muslim majority areas. And with that understanding, we can have a very rich and harmonious society.
We've dealt with Somalia to some extent. There is a Christian community there. Other parts of Africa where Christians are perhaps suffering from more directed persecution. If you have some observations you want to make about that, Kenya does serve as an example of a very different positive approach to Muslim-Christian relations. What have you observed? Nigeria, of course, is a focus of ours. Somalia, areas where there have been much more difficult and sometimes violent problems there. What are your observations about those places specifically?
It depends on the very deep historical formations of the different Muslim groups. You know, Muslim, I'm told it's not just one. There are also different straits of faiths within the Muslim setup. And so perhaps it depends on which type has settled in which area. In those countries you have mentioned, it's a challenge perhaps for Christians to just go there and begin expressing themselves openly. And that then brings conflict. So I think the example of Nigeria is public. Certain areas are quite difficult for Christians to operate. Somalia is basically Muslim, so we have not made any serious missionary approach in that place ourselves, though it is open to that work when time comes. But the kind of faiths that first took part in these areas will, on a large space, determine what kind of Islamic faith grows there. Just like in Kenya, there was a certain brand of Christianity, for example, which Muslims were not very comfortable with. Even what we used to call the Crusades, coming to preach there. And so there was a difference between the faiths that we had and those ones which Muslims would comfortably, associate with. So we had to work on that to say, well, we are all the same, so that the Muslims in Kenya can relate with the entire spectrum of the Christian family. As you have rightly put up, there are some countries where it is not easy, but I would think it depends on the brand of the faith that was planted in that country.
Interesting. One of the things I wanted to also ask you about was your work in the Global South Fellowship of Anglican Churches. Can you describe the work that you're undertaking in that fellowship, and how that connects with your broader work as a leader in the Kenyan Anglican Church?
I sort of have retired from all the functions in the church, but I get invited either to address their conferences. I think last time we were in Egypt, he called me just to recognize me and others to say, you are our founding fathers, it's that kind of thing, just encouraging them. But we did quite a lot of work. Mine in the movement, the Global South movement and the GovCon family in those days, was to bring a middle ground where I used to say, if we want to help the church, let's reform it from inside. We don't divide it. I didn't work. I encouraged people to work together, and if there's doctrinal differences, to work on them and ensure we are together in reforming. Because I mentioned that I came from the East African Revival Movement background, where we helped the churches to grow spiritually from within. And that's the kind of contribution I sent and put in the Global South movement, which I think got recognized by those who have taken over. And that's why they keep inviting me to their functions.
Well, it's fascinating what you're doing with that and in all that you've been doing. One of the things that I think it's fair to say is that there's very little awareness in the United States, and I would say in Europe, of the extent to which the Christian communities in Africa are setting an example for faith, evangelization, vibrancy, active engagement in public life. And, it's such a tragedy that with that incredible vibrancy comes certain areas where there is this persecution, which is intense and violent. To conclude, maybe we can talk a little bit about Africa as a whole and Kenya specifically, about why this is such a fertile ground for faith. Why is it that in a sense Africa has become the driver of Christian faith in the world? in a sense, evangelizing back to other parts of the world. It's extraordinary and beautiful. I know that one of the things that we're going to be doing at SPC is we're going on a visit to Nigeria to actually talk to church leaders, Anglican, Catholic, evangelical, and we're both going to look at the persecution happening in Nigeria, but also give a window into the extraordinary faith, the vibrancy of the Christian life that is in Nigeria. And I guess I invite you to talk about Africa and why it is that Africa is becoming this leading place for Christianity in the world.
Well, I think this phenomenon has not just started now. I remember when I was still at college studying theology, as you have rightly read, around from 1985. But basically, the time I was in Toronto at the university there is when we were studying this phenomenon of African Christianity growing so fast. People are asking questions. Why is that African it's just, almost every village is singing, is praying, and is very happily embracing this faith. For us, it was joy for that. We resonated with the mission of Christ very fast, and it was joy to be in it. I remember in 1998 when I was a bishop, a new bishop, when I was just 2 years old as a bishop. We went to Lambeth conference, and we were singing, from Africa. All the bishops were singing, and we changed the entire atmosphere at the conference. And our colleagues from Asia and from all other places joined us. So why is it so? I think it was Professor Beat who said we are notoriously religious. I think it builds from African background, because even in African traditional religion, people were born in religious atmosphere, because everything that happens within African traditional religion bears a religious stamp on it. When a child is born, it is celebrated. During the naming of the child, the initiations, all these are religious. And so when Christianity came, it found that background and very quickly gotten into it, and people embraced it. Yes, this is the thing. So although at certain stage it went along Christianity and different traditional religion, but at the end, I think Christianity has won.
It's definitely a lesson for us here, where Christianity is being pushed away from the public square, where Christians are being, in very specific ways, prevented from engaging in religious practice and religious expression. So there's battles going on now, as you know, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in much of Western Europe over this question. And I think it's beautiful that we've had you as a guest to talk about the faith of Africa and to talk about lessons that we can learn actually here. Thank you for sharing what you're talking about regarding Africa at large. With that, we've reached the end of this edition of SPC Conversations. It's been wonderful talking with you, Your Grace. Until next time, to my audience, all good wishes, and thank you for supporting our mission. And again, thank you, Your Grace, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity in this interview. God bless you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.